Chapter-10. The Sage. Perhaps the most difficult subject in this inquiry is the sage. He is both beyond and, though only seemingly, within relativity at the same time. He is thus in two mutually contradictory states at the same time. For relativity and the real are negations of each other. This is the root of the perplexity that besets the ideas of disciples on this subject. The sacred lore mentions two kinds of deliverance. The living sage is said to have one kind of deliverance. When his body dies, there is another kind of it. The first is called Jivan Mukti, deliverance while in living form, in life. The sage that has it is called a Jivan Mukta. And the second type of deliverance is called Videha Mukti, bodiless deliverance. The sage tells us that there is only one kind of deliverance, namely egolessness. Since the world has no existence without the ego, it follows that the sage is bodiless, in fact, whatever he may seem to be. Even those that think that the sage has a body and mind and are unable to realize that they are unreal can understand this much, that his causal body, which is the primary ignorance, has been dissolved, and that therefore the sage, who is just the self and nothing else, Atman, is in no way connected with the surviving subtle and gross bodies, as the ignorant one thinks himself to be. For the sage, therefore, nothing exists except the self, Atman. There is neither body, nor mind, nor world, nor other persons. In speaking of the sage, therefore, we need to keep distinct the 2 points of view, the point of view of the semi-ignorant disciple and that of the sage himself. The sage has repeatedly emphasized that for him there is no problem at all, no need of reconciling inconsistencies. From the point of view of the sage, all the 3 bodies are non-existent. Not only that, the sage does not even recognize that they existed before. Hence, it is only as a concession to the semi-ignorant disciple that the distinction is mentioned in the books. The absolute truth of deliverance is that it is bodiless and worldless, because deliverance is the state where the truth alone shines. The Jivan Mukta is therefore not a person. But because of the dual role stated before, personality is attributed to the sage, to the Jivan Mukta. In the Upanishadic lore, this point of view is tolerated, and it is said that his body, that is, the body of the sage, will be subject to the law of causality while it survives. By the force of this law, his body will be affected by the reactions, pleasant or unpleasant, of previous actions, which are called karmas. These are divided into 3 parts or lots. There is the particular lot of karmas which came to fruition at birth, which gave the sage the present body, and will go on regulating what happens to it till it dies. This karma is called prarabdha, because it has begun to yield fruit in this life. There is another lot of karma called agami, actions yet to come. And the remainder is called sanchita, the reserve, This is an enormous lot because of the great number of past lives that one has lived. It is said that the first lot alone retains its power, the prarabdha, but that second and third lots become liquidated when one becomes a sage, because individuality is lost. The sage will have no more rebirth, nor will he go to other worlds, but he will reap the fruits of prarabdha, or the current karma. So says the ancient lore in some places. We shall see that this is not strictly correct. We have seen before that the sage is in the natural state, in sahaja samadhi, always. This is not, as we have seen, the Kevala nirvikalpa samadhi of the yogi, which is inconstant. This natural state is not inimical to the automatic bodily activities which are attributed to the sage. So it may be said, in a sense, that the sage is awake to the self and to the world also. The sage seems to eat and sleep and live like other persons because he is in the sahaja, the natural state. The sage is able to hear and answer questions. The yogi that is sometimes in trance of nirvikalpa and sometimes awake cannot give us any such teaching because he himself is still in bondage and ignorance. If there were no sahaja state, then it would happen that whoever obtains direct and perfect experience of the self would at once cease to appear with a body in this world. And thus there would never be anyone who could impart authentic teaching about the self and the method of finding it. But the sahaja state exists and is attained by some rare seeker now and then. Thus the teaching of the sacred lore is confirmed and corrected, added to where necessary, and made intelligible to qualified disciples by an unbroken line of sages. Within historical times there were the sages Gautama Buddha and Shankara. How many others there were we do not know. This office is now fulfilled by the sage Bhagavan Ramana. Those that have not heard and understand the truth of the natural state, namely that it is not inimical like the Kevala to bodily activity, raise a question about the sage, the answer to which is not easy to understand for all. Even among the sage's disciples, there are some who cannot understand the answer. But that is so because they are believers in a fascinating but complicated creed, in which the chief tenet is that the world is real as such. It is therefore quite natural that they should refuse to understand the sage's teachings, of which the essential part is that the world is not real as such. They are dualists, in fact, and as such, violent haters of Advaitic teaching. In this connection, we may take note of the tenderness the sage shows for the weaknesses of believers. The sage observes the rules enunciated in the Gita, that no one's faith should be disturbed. Therefore, when ardent dualists are present, the sage is very careful in what he says. He does not, while they are present, give out clear Advaitic teaching. But as soon as the dualists go out, he turns round to the Advaitis and that remain in the gathering and apologetically explains to them that he had to water down the teaching to suit the dualists. The sage thus treats the latter as immature and the Advaitic followers as adults who can understand that allowances have to be made to the immature. But he leaves us in no doubt at all that the Advaitic teaching is the highest there can be. We have two kinds of views about the sage. First, there is the view that is held by those who claim to be Advaitic followers, but who have not sat at the feet of the sage. Then there is the view held by disciples of the sage, who are hostile to his Advaitic teaching. The former class of people argue this way. The person called Ramana Maharshi lives in the world very much like other people. He eats and sleeps and acts and talks and does other things. He remembers the past and answers questions about it. Therefore, he has both ego and mind. Also, he says I, you, and he on occasion, just as we do. Therefore, he is not a Jivan Mukta, though we are willing to allow that he is a holy being. We need have no quarrel with these people. It is clear that they imagine the Kevala Nirvikalpa to be the final state. Hence, they are unable to understand how a sage can live among men as a light from the real self. To be able to recognize a sage, one must be a genuine devotee of the real self, Atman. This implies a refinement of understanding, a humbleness of spirit, and other virtues. For such a one, the sage has a real and abiding attraction. On the other hand, those that are in love with bondage, even though they are learned in the sacred lore, are not so attracted. They are prosperous in a worldly sense and think themselves happy. And they are perhaps afraid that if they go to the sage, he might effect a change in their outlook, of the consequences of which they are sincerely afraid. Being so afraid, they keep at a safe distance from the sage. But those that have been attracted to the sage, having felt keenly the need of a competent guru, are able to see that the sage is something unique. They may take time to understand that he is a sage. That is because they need first to understand what a sage is, and what are the unfailing marks of a sage. The one unfailing mark is the non-perception of difference. Now we shall consider the other view, that which is upheld by certain sectarian devotees of the sage. They say that he is a sage, but they also maintain that he is a person. They say that he is an exalted person. They hold it as an article of belief that personality is real and that it persists after deliverance, though inconsistently enough, they admit that the ego is lost in deliverance. The sage, they say, has a mind and therefore has a distinct existence. They say that in deliverance, the mind is changed into something wonderful and becomes endowed with divine powers called siddhis. To these powers, they attach a profound importance. They seem to think that it is these powers that prove him to be a sage. We have seen in the chapter on God that the essential teaching of the sage is the truth of non-becoming, which means that reality never actually became the three, the world, soul, and God, and these being merely creations of the ego mind, which is itself unreal. In other words, the sage is at one with the sage Shankara in saying that this is all Maya, illusion. The sage of Arunachala explains that deliverance consists in the reduction to nothingness of what is always nothing. The threefold false appearance is unreal even now, but appears as real through ignorance. That appearance will cease in such a way that it could not even be said that it appeared before and ceased to appear later. This is made clear by the following utterance of the sage. which tells us what is accomplished by the Guru's grace. The sage Bhagavan said, reducing the unreal to unreality and causing the one real self to shine, the Guru puts a final end to the unreal soul. The sectarian views under discussion are certainly not reconcilable with these teachings. We have seen that the cities which loom large in the eyes of these disciples are unreal, being part of the world illusion, which is the substance of bondage. It is therefore ridiculous, as the sage points out, to seek to appraise the greatness of a sage by the spiritual powers that seem to be manifested in his presence. The rejection of the truth of non-becoming has led these disciples to misunderstand the sage. One such misunderstanding is pointed out and corrected by the sage when he said, ignorant people say the sage sees differences but enjoys non-difference in them. This non-perception of differences is twofold, as non-perception of difference between oneself and others, and non-perception of difference among others. The former is manifested by the sage's indifference to praise and censure. The latter is seen in what is termed the equal I, which is referred to in the famous but much misunderstood verse of the Gita, where it is said that sages look with equal eye on all creatures. The former quality is, as we have seen in the first chapter, peculiar to the sage. No one that is not perfectly egoless is naturally unaffected by praise and censorship, as is indicated by the verse cited on page earlier in the book. There is a historical anecdote connected with this verse, which is told of a sage of the recent past, and we must presume that the incident took place before he attained sagehood. The Holy One had renounced the world at an early age and was wandering in the forests, practicing samadhi for the sake of deliverance. And once a co-pupil of his met him somewhere and warmly praised him to his face. The Holy One was visibly elated, and this was noticed by the other. It was a surprise to him that such a Holy One could be moved by praise. He at once expressed what he thought. The Holy One replied by uttering the verse cited above. The meaning of this: it is next to impossible for one to cast off subjection to the harlot, praise, even though he has renounced the world as trash and mastered the secrets of the sacred lore. While even a trace of egoism remains, the hearing of praise or censure will automatically cause a sense of pleasure or pain. The egoless one is not moved by these. He does not feel pleasure or pain from praise or blame, as is expressed by the sage in the following words when he said, to one who is firmly established in the blissful natural state beyond change, and therefore is not aware of difference, who does not think I am one and he is another, who is there other than the self. If anyone says anything about him, what matters it? For him it is just the same as if it was said by himself. Non-perception of difference among others, which is called equality of vision, is equally a peculiar feature of the sage. We have noticed that the sage does not recognize distinctions, whether natural or man-made. This is what the sage says about it. The equal vision of the sage is just the recognition that the one self, which is consciousness, is present in all that appears. In other words, it is egolessness. The same is the meaning of the grossly misunderstood and misapplied text of the Gita, where it is said that the sage looks with equal eye on all creatures. This equal eye is not for the ego-ridden ones, because they do not see the real self in all. Equal vision does not consist in acting as if all human beings are equal as such. Not equality, but unity is the teaching, and that can be realized only by oneself becoming egoless. In this connection, we may remember the caution against applying the teaching of non-difference in action.